Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a preview of our Classics Today Insider special video, available to all ClassicsToday.com subscribers, on the 10 best recordings of Christoph von Dohnányi, one of the great conductors who's still with us. He's in his 90s. He was born in 1929. He had a very interesting life and a very interesting pedigree. Christoph von Dohnányi was the grandson, or is the grandson, he's still with us, of the composer Erno Dohnányi, the Hungarian composer who actually wound up at Florida State University, which is where his grandson studied with him, because his father, Hans von Dohnányi, was, at that point, the family was German. He was born in Berlin, and his father and his uncle and their relatives were all involved in the opposition to Hitler, and they were interned at concentration camps and executed in 1945. So Christoph von Dohnányi, after the war, decided to get into a musical career and follow in his grandfather's footsteps, which he did. And the result, as they say, is history. Now, what interests me so much about Christoph von Dohnányi, particularly, is his career in Cleveland, which took place between 1984 and 2002. He was there for 20 years, because he was there for a couple of years before he started. Officially, he was working there for a couple of years, but he was with that orchestra for 20 years, and it was unquestionably, I think, another golden age for that orchestra after George Szell and then Loren Maazel and then Dohnányi, because they made a fabulous series of recordings, fantastic recordings. I mean, the evidence is there for anyone who wants to hear. And of course, he was working not just in Cleveland, but also at the Vienna Philharmonic and in London. And, he was a typical modern conductor, zipping around and doing things. But he was a very, very fine conductor. But he made a wonderful remark that got me to thinking in doing this preview video. And the remark was this. He said, "We give a great performance and George Szell gets a great review." The reason is because, here's the nugget that I want to get at. I've said this many times. Are conductors better than the orchestras, or are the orchestras better than the conductors? And what is the conductor's relationship to the orchestra? Does the conductor change the orchestra or foster a continuation of the traditions of the orchestra? Because the reality of the situation in Cleveland is that Szell's power over that orchestra, his ability to shape that orchestra and frame the orchestra, was so powerful, and he was so beloved, and he had such unquestionable support from both the musicians in the orchestra and the city and, the organization itself, that the Cleveland Orchestra remains to this day an orchestra very much in Szell's image in terms of sonority, precision, accuracy. It's a cool orchestra. In other words, it's not known for its hot and heavy romantic repertoire. It's not like the Philadelphia Orchestra was under Ormandy, an orchestra that has tremendous warmth of sound and that gushes in romantic music. It's an orchestra that can play anything and do it all in a stylish way, that plays with exquisite taste, with fabulous technical security, and what's more, that is absolutely superb in contemporary music, because contemporary music requires very, very tricky rhythms often, and is technically quite complicated. And so it plays very complex music with tremendous clarity and shapeliness. And Szell himself often, insisted that when he was not the conductor, he beat it into the orchestra that they were going to be at their very best with whoever their guest conductor was, because they were not going to embarrass him as the music director of Cleveland. They were going to be great no matter who conducted them. And so he instilled in that orchestra a genuine esprit de corps, which really survived. And so I get Dohnányi's point. But the fact also is that Cleveland chose music directors who were not known for being crazy interventionists. I mean, Maazel was a little bit unusual because he was just odd. I mean, he had some odd predilections when it came to interpretation, but he was an extraordinary technician at the same time, and he maintained that orchestra's very, very high technical standard. There's no question about that. So then when Dohnányi rolled in, Dohnányi was another conductor who was not a heavy-duty interventionist. I mean, this is most evident, really, in his recordings of Mahler, which are almost uniformly awful. I mean, that was his real weakness. And he was on record as saying he disliked Leonard Bernstein's Mahler because it was too emotional, it was hot and heavy and not, he gave all these sort of excuses for why his rather dull and uninteresting Mahler, and I saw a lot of it live, and it was a snooze fest, trust me. Why he was doing it right and others were doing it wrong, and no one believed him. I mean, that was his bugbear, really. Everybody has their Achilles heel musically, and that was Dohnányi's, I think, because just about everything else he did marvelously. And he recorded principally for 3 labels, for Telarc, for Decca, and for the one that isn't Decca, that I just forgot about, Telarc and Decca and Warner, thank you. Teldec at the time. But here's the issue. Did he change the orchestra in any noticeable way, or did he simply sustain the orchestra along the lines of what it had already been doing and was really good at and noted for? I think the answer in this case is unquestionably the second thing. And we don't value that, which is wrong. It's entirely wrong because it takes a lot to maintain an orchestra, to maintain an extremely high standard, a high level of finish, of ability, of finding the right players, of sustaining an ensemble, especially when you've been there for 20 years, as Dohnányi was. He deserves full credit for that. And it was really the same thing, actually, in Philadelphia with Ormandy, because when Ormandy came following Stokowski, remember, everybody said, well, Stokowski built the orchestra and Ormandy just maintained it. And I said, it's bullshit. You don't stay with an orchestra as Ormandy did for, what was it? It was like 30 some odd, 40 years, God knows what, and keep them at this level unless it's you who are doing the work. It's not a self-sustaining mechanism. Although the standard of the orchestra and the corporate sense of ensemble and all those things can be inbred in a way into the ensemble itself, to keep it that way, to maintain it, that requires genuine willingness from the guy at the head of the podium, the guy on the podium, to really do it. Because remember, when Ormandy left and Muti took over, that Philadelphia sound ceased to exist. It simply ceased to exist because it wasn't Muti's thing. So he did not sustain the same tradition. The orchestra remained great, appallingly great, fabulously great, but not in the same way. But with Cleveland, we've had the orchestra remaining great in the same way. They have continued that tradition initiated by George Szell by choosing music directors whose own interpretive predilections were similar to those that George Szell espoused. And that was, I think that's a fully conscious thing, because that continued from Dohnányi to Franz Welser-Most. I mean, who also, people tend to denigrate him as well, because he's not the most ostentatious of conductors, but he's fantastic in contemporary music. He does some things extremely well, and he has that orchestra playing fabulously. They have maintained their standards, and Dohnányi was a major chunk, a major chunk of that legacy. He really was. And so it's going to be just a tremendous amount of fun to go back and to look at that legacy in the ClassicsToday.com Insider Special Subscriber video, and talk about what I think his 10 best recordings were. And there were a lot of them. It was not an easy choice, because he really, really had that orchestra playing at as high a standard as you could have. And some of the concerts I saw Dohnányi in Cleveland give live, when they were on tour here, when they came to New York, because they always did a few concerts here in New York, were some of the best concerts I've ever seen in my life. They were astonishing, absolutely astonishing. And I had friends there who really knew what they were talking about too, and they looked at them and went, ah! Unbelievable. And it wasn't because of George Szell. It was because you had a genuine collaboration, as we did with Dohnányi in Vienna. You had an orchestra with a definite corporate identity and a conductor who was able to sustain it and who conveyed his interpretive ideas through that corporate identity, just as Dohnányi did in Vienna with the Vienna Philharmonic. He didn't change the way the Vienna Philharmonic sounded. He brought out the best in what they were in terms of his own interpretations. And that's a gift. It's a gift that really deserves to be recognized. It's not the easiest one to hear, perhaps, or the easiest one to recognize. It's not like a Stokowski where you reorchestrate everything, or Celibidache where you do everything at half tempo, or any of these people who are making a show of who they are, drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't like that at all. It was a selfless, humble, honest, but incredibly musical and marvelously masterful career that Dohnányi had in Cleveland and in elsewhere. It had in his entire career, everywhere. And I would like to take this opportunity in that video to celebrate that career. So if you are not a Classics Today subscriber and you'd like to see the video, the sign-up information is down below. Please do consider signing up and joining us on one of our handy-dandy, easy, quite affordable payment plans. You can do a monthly or a yearly or a whatever. And let's celebrate the career of this really unassuming but incredibly vital and musicianly and rewarding conductor who I have said a million times desperately deserves a big box set from Decca before he's dead. I mean, why do you have to wait? Just do it. And, don't divide it up into the Cleveland years and the Vienna years and the whatever years. Just throw it all in a box and release it and do it, because he's really, really good. And there are a lot of individual titles, singleton titles that we don't pay attention to anymore, like his Shostakovich 10th or maybe his Richard Strauss recording. There's some of those that are just splendid, absolutely splendid. And, his Brahms Schoenberg piano quartet. I mean, he did all kinds of interesting one-off projects that are fantastic and that deserve to be celebrated and acknowledged. So with that said, I'm going to turn you loose to go over and look at the Classics Today special feature, or simply enjoy this one and go listen to some Dohnányi recordings. And keep on listening, friends. There's so much great music out there. Thank you for joining me. Take care.